Have you ever really noticed that sort of universal silhouette of aging? You know, you picture an older person walking down the street, and there's that really distinct, pronounced forward-leaning hunch.
Oh, yeah. The stooped posture, usually combined with that really cautious kind of shuffling gait. I mean, it's probably one of the most widely recognized visual markers of a human body getting older.
Right, and I always just assumed that was a top-down structural problem.
Mhm.
You look at the bend in their back, and you naturally think, well, their spine is crumbling, or maybe their upper back muscles are just too weak to hold their head up anymore.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's a highly visible symptom, right? When the bend is happening in the spine, human intuition tells us the root cause must be, located directly inside those vertebrae.
But welcome to Today in the Hypothesis, where we are looking at some research that completely flips that intuition upside down. So, have you ever wondered why we actually lean forward as we age? Because the sources we're exploring today point to a radically different culprit. The collapse doesn't start in the spine. It actually starts in our butts.
Yeah, it's a wild concept. What we're looking at is a profound paradigm shift in how we understand human biomechanics. The forward lean is actually a systemic failure of the body's entire kinetic chain, and that failure initiates with the deterioration of the gluteus maximus.
Exactly. And we're pulling this from an exhaustively researched paper synthesized by Gemini. The underlying work is by an independent researcher named Victor H. Satouche, and it's titled, bear with me here, Evolutionary and Biomechanical Analysis of Gluteal Sarcopenia and Postural Progression in the Aging Hominid.
It is quite the title.
Right. I know it's a mouthful, but the core premise is wildly compelling. It basically argues that the forward lean is what happens when this massive, uniquely human muscle, the gluteus maximus, just begins to fail.
Right, because when that engine cuts out, the body is forcibly reorganizing its entire posture just to stop from falling over.
Yeah. And to really grasp the sheer magnitude of this mechanical collapse, we first have to understand the evolutionary anomaly of the human rear end. Like, if you look at our closest living relatives, chimpanzees or gorillas, their gluteal muscles are entirely different from ours.
Oh, completely. They don't have that projection at all. They have very, very flat profile.
Right, which is so funny to think about. Why is that?
Well, it's because in non-human primates, the gluteal muscles are relatively small. They serve a totally different primary function. They essentially act as hip abductors and rotators.
Meaning they pull the leg outward.
Exactly. Their job is to help the animal move its leg away from the center of the body or to twist it, which, if you think about it, is incredibly useful for climbing and navigating through, complex arboreal environments, trees, vines, that sort of thing.
Right, but they aren't the massive power-producing extensor muscles that define the human lower body.
No, not at all.
So how did we get from a climbing muscle to this massive engine on our backsides? The paper traces this architectural shift back millions of years to early hominids like Sahelanthropus.
Yeah, the transition to upright bipedalism required a radical reorganization of our skeleton. The human ilium, which is the uppermost largest bone of the pelvis, it had to change shape entirely.
It had to morph.
Basically, yes. In a chimp, the ilium is really long and narrow, and it's situated more on the back of the animal. But in humans, the ilium became short, broad, and the walls actually shifted to face laterally, so they sort of wrap around the sides of our body.
Essentially turning the pelvis into a bowl shape rather than a long paddle.
A bowl shape is a great way to put it. And that structural bowl is what brought our vertebral column much closer to the hip joint. It provided a stable, balanced base for the trunk to sit directly over the legs.
Right, balancing that heavy torso.
Exactly. But more importantly, that broad surface area created the necessary anchor point for the gluteus maximus to expand into the powerhouse muscle we rely on today.
Which, okay, this brings us to a detail in the research that completely caught me off guard. We have this massive muscle, arguably the defining physical trait that allows a human to be bipedal. You would naturally assume its main job is to help us walk around all day.
Oh, absolutely. That's what everyone assumes.
But the electromyographic studies, the EMG data, where they actually measure the electrical activity in the muscles, it busts that myth wide open.
The EMG data is incredibly counterintuitive. During regular level walking at a normal pace, the gluteus maximus is largely silent.
Wait, silent? Like not doing anything?
Basically, yes. The electrical activity is minimal. Your momentum and the mechanics of your lower legs are doing the vast majority of the work.
I was trying to wrap my head around this.
Yeah.
Because if the largest muscle in our body isn't the engine for walking, what is its actual evolutionary purpose. And the author suggests it's actually the braking system for running.
Yes, it is the ultimate stabilizing force. Think about the physics of running. You're striking the ground with high-impact alternating legs. Every single time your foot hits the dirt, your body generates intense forward momentum.
Right.
That kinetic energy actively wants to pitch your heavy torso face first into the ground.
Oh, so it's an evolutionary pitch controller, like the flaps on an airplane keeping the nose level.
That's a perfect analogy. The gluteus maximus is the emergency brake that violently contracts and pulls your trunk back upright. It keeps your center of gravity safely stacked right over your hips.
Wow. So bringing this back to the phenomenon of aging, we can suddenly see where our vulnerability lies. The human body evolved over millions of years to rely on this massive pitch controller to fight gravity.
Right.
And when that specific muscle begins to weaken and atrophy, we lose our primary defense against gravity, pulling our torso downward. The bipedal architecture just fundamentally destabilizes.
It does, and this makes the stakes of our modern lifestyle incredibly high. I mean, if you are listening to this right now while sitting in your car commuting or, hunched over a laptop at your desk, the paper suggests your current posture is actively contributing to a modern evolutionary crisis.
Which is a terrifying phrase.
It really is. We're losing this muscle through a devastating combination of natural biological aging and an unnatural cultural invention, which is the chair.
The dreaded chair. Let's dig into the biology first, though. The biological side of this equation revolves around a process called sarcopenia, right?
Yes, sarcopenia. And this isn't just the mild weakness you feel when you skip the gym for a few weeks. It's a profound, progressive loss of skeletal muscle mass, strength, and functional performance that just accelerates as we age. And the gluteus maximus is uniquely susceptible to this particular type of decay.
Yeah, the paper mentions that the glutes are packed with type 2 muscle fibers. Does that fiber type make them more vulnerable somehow?
It does. So type 2 fibers are your fast twitch fibers. They're responsible for explosive power, sprinting, and those rapid, unconscious postural corrections that keep you from tripping.
Like catching your balance when you stumble.
Exactly. The biological catch, though, is that type 2 fibers are the very first to atrophy as we age, especially if we start engaging in explosive or high-resistance movements.
But the physical shrinking of the muscle is only part of the nightmare here. The research introduces this concept of myosteatosis, which sounds, honestly, vaguely terrifying.
Is that literally fat replacing the muscle?
Yeah, it's fatty infiltration. Intramuscular adipose tissue begins to deposit inside the muscle belly itself. The researchers utilized MRI and CT imaging to examine the glutes of elderly individuals, specifically classified as fallers.
Fallers, meaning people who fall a lot.
Right. These are patients with impaired balance who experience frequent falls.
Oh, man. I imagine the scans of a faller's glutes look drastically different from, say, a healthy young adult. The visual difference on an MRI is striking. The muscle of a faller might look like it still has physical volume from the outside, but internally, it's heavily marbled with fat.
Like a steak.
Exactly like a marbled steak. It loses its density. The structural integrity is compromised to the point where it simply lacks the functional torque required to stabilize the human trunk. It basically becomes an illusion of a functional muscle.
That's, wow. But I'm sitting here thinking, even if the muscle is marbled or slightly weaker, it is still attached to my brain, right?
Yeah.
Like if I just stand up from my desk right now, my nervous system will tell my glutes to fire. I can just consciously choose to use them.
See, that is where the cultural disaster of the chair comes into play, because the physical decay is compounded by a deep neurological failure known clinically as gluteal amnesia.
Gluteal amnesia.
Yeah. Or you'll also hear physical therapists refer to it as dead butt syndrome.
Dead butt syndrome.
Yeah.
I'm honestly so glad the medical community has embraced a term that descriptive. But how does my brain actually forget how to use my own backside?
Well, it comes down to the body functioning as a system of biological pulleys. Because modern humans spend the vast majority of their waking hours sitting in chairs, our hip flexors, which are the muscles on the front of our hips, primarily the psoas, they remain in a chronically shortened, contracted position.
Because our knees are pulled up toward our chest, relatively speaking.
Right. So they become hypertonic, meaning
Yeah.
they're tight all the time.
So if the front pulley is constantly tightened, what does that do to the back pulley?
It triggers a neurological phenomenon called reciprocal inhibition. Your nervous system detects that the front muscles are constantly engaged and pulling tight. To prevent the muscles from tearing each other apart in a tug of war, the brain actively shuts down the opposing muscle on the back.
Oh, wow. It cuts the power.
It completely cuts the power to the gluteus maximus. Over decades of sitting, the nervous system quite literally forgets the motor pattern required to recruit those gluteal fibers. You stand up, you try to move, and the signal simply doesn't reach the muscle.
That is deeply unsettling. We are sitting so much that we're forcing our brains to delete the software required to run our largest muscle group.
Exactly.
And the source material provides some fascinating cross-cultural evidence to separate this from, inevitable human destiny. They looked at traditional hunter-gatherer societies, specifically the Hadza of Tanzania and the Simony of Bolivia.
Right, and looking at these populations is vital because it isolates our biology from our industrialized habits.
Yeah, and I always pictured hunter-gatherers as being in perpetual motion, just running across the savannah all day. But the data shows they're actually sedentary for about 10 hours a day. That's roughly the same amount of inactive time as an accountant sitting in an office building.
Yeah, the total duration of inactivity is strikingly similar, but the mechanics of that inactivity are completely different. The Hadza do not utilize chairs. They spend those 10 hours in what anthropologists classify as active resting postures.
You mean like squatting or kneeling by a fire?
Precisely. When a person rests in a deep squat, they're technically sedentary, sure, but their body is forced to maintain a baseline level of tension throughout the gluteal and core musculature just to hold the position.
So it's a slow drip of muscle engagement all day long.
It acts as continuous, lifelong mechanical maintenance. The muscle never gets the signal that it's obsolete. As a result of this active resting, these populations exhibit maintained endurance, better grip strength, and significantly slower rates of muscle atrophy compared to Western populations of the exact same age.
That completely recontextualizes the hunched older adult we see on the street. The forward lean isn't just the inescapable tragedy of human biology. It's the cultural byproduct of an industrialized chair-shaped life.
Yes, the author refers to it as an inactivity mismatch. Our hominid physiology expects to be actively resting, constantly receiving low-level signals to maintain our extensor muscles.
But instead, we give our bodies a chair.
Right, which neutralizes the muscular demand entirely and accelerates the neurological amnesia.
Okay, so let's trace the mechanics of the collapse then. Because once gluteal amnesia sets in and the brain forgets how to fire our primary stabilizing engine, gravity doesn't just turn off. The body has to find a backup plan to keep the torso from crashing to the floor.
And that biological backup plan is the exact trigger for the kinetic domino effect that ruins our posture. When the gluteus maximus goes offline, the immense burden of maintaining the upright torso violently shifts to surrounding muscle groups, specifically the hamstrings on the back of the legs and the erector spinae muscles in the lower back.
I was really trying to visualize this shift in power. Imagine you have a massive, high-wattage appliance, like an industrial refrigerator.
Okay.
That's your torso. The gluteus maximus is the heavy-duty 220-volt wall outlet specifically designed to handle that massive electrical draw. But suddenly, that wall outlet dies. Your body panics. It still needs to run the refrigerator, so it frantically unplugs it and plugs it into a cheap, flimsy extension cord, which would be the hamstrings.
That mechanical comparison is actually highly accurate.
Yeah.
The hamstrings are technically synergists in hip extension. They assist the glutes, so when the main engine fails, they attempt to take over the primary workload. But there's a fatal architectural flaw in relying on the hamstrings. They are biarticular muscles.
Wait, biarticular, meaning they cross over two separate joints.
Yes. The hamstrings originate at the bottom of the pelvis, they run down the back of the thigh, and they attach below the knee. They cross both the hip joint and the knee joint. Because their tension is split across two moving hinges, they're incredibly poorly suited to act as the primary anchor for trunk stability.
So what happens when the body forces them to carry the wattage of the entire human torso?
The whole system short circuits. As the hamstrings desperately contract to hold the torso upright, they pull fiercely downward on their origin point at the base of the pelvis. This constant downward tug rotates the entire pelvis backward, creating what's known as a posterior pelvic tilt. They're essentially tucking your tailbone under your body.
And since the spine is stacked directly on top of the pelvis, changing the angle of the foundation ruins the alignment of the whole tower.
Exactly. The kinematic analysis in the paper measures this shift using the sagittal vertical axis, or SVA. Picture a plumb line dropping straight down from the C7 vertebrae. That's the prominent bump at the base of your neck. In a healthy posture, that line should fall straight down through the back of your sacrum. But as the hamstrings drag the pelvis into a posterior tilt, that axis increases.
The plumb line swings forward, so your body's center of mass is literally being displaced out into the empty space in front of your toes.
Right. It becomes an ongoing physics equation. Gravity is acting on the heavy mass of the trunk at a certain distance from the hip joint. As the gluteal strength drops, the body can no longer generate the muscular torque required to counteract the force of gravity, so it has to find a new mechanical equilibrium point.
It adjusts the angle of the trunk forward, resulting in that pronounced stoop.
Yeah, and to start from face planting into the sidewalk, older adults adopt that cautious gait. They widen their stance to increase their base of support, take shorter, shuffling strides, and keep their center of mass hovering safely over their lead foot. It's really just a desperate balancing act.
The entire kinetic chain has been reorganized around a point of failure. But, and this is fascinating, the research raises an incredibly important nuance here. The data shows a stark divide in how this collapse physically manifests. Does this mechanical failure look the same for everyone? The answer is no.
Right. The paper details some major gender dimorphism. Men and women experience this postural decline on vastly different trajectories.
Let's dig into that. Why is it so different?
Well, the biological differences in skeletal morphology, specifically the pelvis, combined with differing metabolic aging profiles, they create two distinct paths of collapse. Let's look at females first. Women generally possess a wider, broader pelvis. This evolutionary adaptation fundamentally alters the biomechanics of the hip joint. It inherently places a higher baseline demand on lateral stability and different torque requirements on the glutes.
But the paper also heavily emphasizes the role of hormonal changes, particularly during aging.
Oh, absolutely. Estrogen plays a massive protective role in muscle metabolism and maintaining muscle mass. The sudden drop in estrogen levels during menopause makes females significantly more susceptible to that accelerated fat infiltration, the myostetosis we discussed earlier. The loss of estrogen directly promotes the accumulation of fatty deposits inside the muscle tissue, rapidly degrading its strength.
The structural outcomes detailed in the paper are striking. It notes that females over the age of 30 demonstrate a 35% increase in anterior pelvic tilt as they age, along with a 49% greater pelvic drop compared to men. This extreme pelvic instability frequently leads to excessive lumbar lordosis.
Right, which is a sharp, painful inward curve in the lower back, and that happens before eventually resulting in the forward kyphosis, or hunch.
Okay, so that's women. What about men?
Men, on the other hand, exhibit a different pattern of decay. Instead of rampant fat infiltration marbling the muscle, men tend to experience more direct muscle shrinkage, a physical thinning of the muscle fibers. Interestingly, their pelvic tilt remains relatively stable throughout their lifespan compared to women.
But wait, if a man's pelvis isn't tilting nearly as much, why do we still see so many older men leaning forward?
Because the male trajectory tends toward thoracic hyperkyphosis. That is the classic pronounced hump in the upper back. This specific curvature seems to be driven less by pelvic instability and more by the direct, massive loss of spinal extensor strength in the mid to upper back. The muscles simply fail to hold the ribcage upright.
Which really highlights a critical nuance the author makes sure to address. We can't blame absolutely everything just on the glutes. The forward lean is a synergistic collapse of multiple systems.
It is a systemic failure. The sarcopenia is destroying the trunk muscles at the exact same time skeletal degeneration is taking hold. The paper points out that kyphosis affects 20% to 40% of older adults, and it is heavily driven by osteoporosis.
So the bone density drops, the vertebrae become brittle, and they suffer microfractures that physically wedge the spine into a forward curve. But the paper calls this relationship a vicious circle.
It's a terrifying feedback loop, really. The osteoporosis causes the initial vertebral fractures, which bends the spine forward, but because the glutes and paraspinal muscles are suffering from amnesia and sarcopenia, they fail to act as a muscular brace for the spine.
They can't hold it straight.
Right, and without that muscular support, the vertebrae endures even more pressure, which accelerates further fractures. The skeleton and the muscles are locked in a mutual downward spiral.
Man. So knowing all the deeply ingrained mechanics of this collapse, the fast-twitch fiber loss, the biarticular hamstring takeover, the vicious circle of bone loss, and the chair-shaped life, how do we possibly prevent or reverse it? To find solutions, the sources explore historical labor data, the socioeconomics of modern diets, and remarkably centuries-old religious rituals.
Yeah, when it comes to solutions, it fundamentally boils down to preservation. And as the research bluntly points out, preserving human muscle tissue requires significant resources.
Let's look at the socioeconomic barrier first. The paper states that to effectively fight sarcopenia and maintain that muscle mass, an older adult needs a high protein intake, specifically 1.2 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight every single day.
That is a substantial amount of protein, and high-quality protein is expensive. For many impoverished populations globally, hitting that daily macronutrient target is a financial impossibility,
They simply can't afford the building blocks to keep the glutes functioning.
which leads to a much higher prevalence of what clinicians call sarcopenic obesity in lower socioeconomic brackets. When populations are forced to rely on diets high in cheap processed fats and low in protein, it rapidly accelerates that intramuscular fat accumulation. The muscle doesn't just shrink, it's actively replaced by the cheap calories being consumed.
So if diet is a hurdle, you might assume the physical solution is just to get a highly demanding active job, like throw on the office chair and go work on a construction site or a farm. But the data reveals a fascinating paradox regarding manual labor.
It seems logical that physical labor would preserve physical strength. And it is true that our transition to a sedentary, service-oriented economy removed the daily mechanical loading necessary to maintain our biological muscle reserves. However, and this is key, the data strongly indicates that lifetime exposure to extreme manual work can actually increase frailty in old age.
But really? It makes it worse.
It can. The paper specifically cites lifting more than 25 kilograms continuously for 40-plus years. That level of strain actually lowers grip strength and mobility later in life.
Because you're just grinding the machine down to the bone.
Exactly. The joints and cartilage degrade faster than the muscles can adapt. The evolutionary ideal for postural preservation isn't back-breaking industrial labor. It is the moderate, consistent, lifelong loading we discussed with the traditional foraging societies.
Which perfectly sets up one of the most unexpected and honestly brilliant findings in this entire paper. If we need moderate daily loading, but we don't live in a hunter-gatherer society, how do we get it? The researchers looked at religious praxis acting as physical therapy. Specifically, the source analyzes the biomechanics of the Islamic prayer ritual, salat.
This is a phenomenal example of a cultural and spiritual practice inadvertently acting as an anatomical safeguard. Salat is a prayer ritual performed 5 times a day, every day, and it involves a very specific sequence of standing, bowing, and prostration.
I would never have expected an evolutionary biomechanics paper to feature an EMG analysis of prayer, but the muscle activation data is incredible. Let's walk through the mechanics of these movements. First, the worshiper performs a bowing motion known as rukuk.
Biomechanically speaking, rukuk functions as an active load stretch. The individual hinges at the hips, keeping the back straight, which actively elongates the hamstrings and the spinal extensors while under tension.
Then the sequence moves to prostration on the floor called sujud.
In physical therapy, we utilize a very similar movement called Williams flexion exercises. Or, if you practice yoga, you know it as child's pose. Prostration entirely relieves the vertical compression on the spinal discs while deeply stretching the erector spinae muscles along the lower back.
But the real magic, according to the researchers, happens when rising from that prostration back to a full standing position. Repeating that upward movement acts as a deep bodyweight squat. To get off the floor without using your hands, your body is forced to recruit and fire the gluteus maximus, strengthening it synergistically with the quadriceps.
And doing the sequence 5 times a day, every single day of your life, essentially acts as a highly effective low-intensity resistance routine. It's built-in maintenance for the exact kinetic chain we've been discussing. The kneeling counteracts the tightness of the hip flexors, the deep squats force the glutes to contract, and the bowing preserves the flexibility of the spine.
It actively combats gluteal amnesia before it can even take root. It is incredible to see a centuries-old spiritual practice validated by modern electromyography as an optimal routine for preserving human bipedalism.
It really is. And when we step back and synthesize all of these distinct threads, the evolutionary history of our pelvis, the cellular biology of sarcopenia, the cultural mismatch of constant sitting, the varied gender trajectories, and the protective benefits of active resting and ritual movement, the overarching conclusion is incredibly robust.
The forward lean of old age is not a mandatory stage of the human experience. It's not something we just have to accept. It's the visible, mechanical result of an evolutionary masterpiece, our gluteus maximus being chronically neglected in the modern world.
Right. The moment the burden of verticality shifts from the glutes to the hamstrings and the lower back, we enter a state of pathological aging, not healthy aging. We are physically retreating from the bipedal efficiency that allowed our hominid ancestors to walk out of Africa and inhabit the globe. Sustaining that verticality requires a deliberate, lifelong commitment to the specific muscle that made it possible in the first place.
So for you listening right now, taking a casual walk around the block isn't going to cut it. The glutes are quiet when you walk. If you want to preserve your bipedal heritage and stay upright, you have to deliberately wake that muscle up. You have to get off the chair, get into active resting postures, do bodyweight squats, do glute bridges on the floor. You have to reverse the neurological amnesia before the dominoes start falling.
You have to remind your central nervous system that the primary engine is still plugged in and ready to work.
Absolutely. So what does this all mean for the future of our species? I want to leave you with a provocative thought to ponder. If our modern chair-centric environment continues to permanently neutralize our glutes, and we pass these sedentary habits down generation after generation, are we witnessing the slow beginning of a reverse evolutionary shift? If we no longer require the explosive pitch controller to survive, will a stooped, forward-leaning posture eventually become the biological default of the human species in a few thousand years?
It's a sobering biomechanical question. Will our skeletons inevitably adapt to the shape of the office chair the exact same way they once adapted to the demands of the open savanna?
Something to think about the next time you sit down at your desk. Thank you for joining us on Today in the Hypothesis. We really hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of our bodies. Make sure to subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive. And please share this with a friend, especially if you know someone who has been sitting in a chair all day. Keep standing tall, keep those engines firing, and we will catch you next time.